Today's podcast is part 2 of a conversation that I had with New Testament professor J.D. Atkins. If you haven't heard part 1, go back, please, to week 1 and listen to that podcast as soon as you can.
My name is J.D. Atkins. I'm Associate Professor of New Testament Language and Literature and Chair of the Biblical Studies Department at Tyndale Theological Seminary in the Netherlands.
It is great to have you back, Dr. J.D. Atkins, for this episode of Exegetically Speaking.
It's great to be back and great to be able to do it a second time.
It is fun. We're doing something different here. You started kind of a reading in Luke 24 last time. We're going to continue that in this particular episode. So if you haven't heard the one we did last week, please go back and make sure you hear that. And in the show notes and in the outro to this podcast, we're going to tell you where you can go and you can kind of hear the whole thing put together. All right, for those who are studying Greek or maybe even Hebrew for the first time, what's your best piece of advice?
Go all in. That's my piece of advice.
Okay.
A lot of times people try to take shortcuts when they're learning a language. Really, the reality of the matter is that if you want to learn it well and not have to restudy and relearn again as much, it's just go devote yourself to it all in the first time through. When I say go all in, and I use that kind of analogy of a poker analogy of making a bet, and I say go all in. Why do you go all in? Well, because it's worth it.
Yeah,
you know there's going to be a big payoff.
It's the treasure in the field, right?
Exactly.
And I'm excited about today's text because we're looking at Luke 24, verses 44 and 45, which is a part of that chapter. As you said last time, this is the Easter story. And there's a lot of things going on here. Give us a little bit of context.
From last week, we just talked about verse 41 and just kind of asking the questions, when did the disciples actually believe, come to faith? And in this story, there's this repetition of this theme of evidence not being enough. That kind of gives the sense of where we're coming. You know? So the apostles, they have the empty tomb, they have seen Jesus, and they've even been invited to touch Jesus, and Luke says that they're still disbelieving. So we're asking the question, well, why? There is a certain sense in which, in Luke 24, seeing is not believing. It's not enough. Something more is needed. And so I want to talk a little bit about what's more is needed, and one of the ways you can start to see that is from discourse analysis.
That's a particular field of study, and Steve Runge has been on our podcast before.
Yeah. And in fact, I depend on Steve when I was writing on this particular topic in Luke 24. Here's what tends to happen. Most of our English Bibles put a paragraph break starting at verse 44. So you have the story, he says, touch me and see, spirit doesn't have flesh and bone as you see me having. He then proceeds to eat broiled fish in their presence.
Right in front of them,
Then he says, these are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you. And he's refers back to the fact that he had predicted his death and resurrection.
And there seems like there's a break there between the fact that he took the fish and he ate it in front of them.
Yeah.
And now he begins speaking to them.
Yeah, that's how most of our English Bibles do it. They put a paragraph break right there when Jesus starts speaking again.
Yeah,
right?
And I'm looking here at the English Standard Version, and that's certainly the case here.
Yeah. I would argue that the paragraph break is in the wrong place, that the paragraph break actually should start at verse 45, which is the phrase, then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures.
Okay.
Right? Now, why do I say the paragraph break ought to be at verse 45, starting at verse 45, rather than at verse 44? Well, if you go through the passage in Greek, what you find is that almost every statement begins with a de or a kai. A de can be translated and or but, or sometimes it's actually such a kind of weak conjunction in Greek that sometimes it's just left untranslated.
Yeah, I've seen it translated now.
Yeah, that's true as well. Yeah, but frequently the English Bibles don't even translate the de.
Yeah, kai is a different word.
Kai is a little different, and sometimes they don't translate the kai as well. But kai, it typically just means and. Occasionally, it can mean even or also, depending on the context. But de and kai, they're kind of weaker conjunctions. They just kind of connect sentences. In Mark's gospel, he uses kai so many times to begin sentences that the English translators just stop saying and. They just skip it. It's kind of a weak connective. And so what you have in this passage is you have this sequence. Almost every statement begins with de or kai. So I'm just going to read to you, starting in verse 36, the key beginnings. De, kai, kai, de, kai, and then verse 44, de again. So verse 44, and then he said to them.
So it's like nothing new is happening here.
Nothing new is
it's
really
just kind
happening,
of going.
Right? But then at verse 45, you have a different conjunction that's used. You have tata. Now, tata is a much stronger conjunction than kai or de. The way Luke uses tata, he doesn't use it very often. And he tends to only use it for two general reasons. One is he uses it to divide a story into two parts, which is, again, one of the reasons why, in this case, I would say that the new paragraph, the second part, actually happens at verse 45. That's the key
44.
transition part of the story.
Yeah.
The other reason that Luke will use tata is to introduce some sort of concluding or climactic speech.
I see.
Right?
Okay.
Which is kind of what we have here.
It's true here, yeah.
What Luke's version, essentially, of the Great Commission that finishes off the story.
Yeah.
As we think about, why does this matter, right? So what? Well, one of the reasons why English Bibles put the paragraph break at verse 44 is they see a thematic difference, right? They see, at verse 44, he starts talking about the scriptures, right?
So new topic, therefore new paragraph.
So it seems like it's a new topic and therefore a new paragraph.
Yeah.
Funny enough, many translations, like the NRSV and others, they begin verse 44 with a then, as if it's a tata.
But it's not.
But it's not. It's a de, right?
Yeah.
And so they even emphasize it. In addition to adding a paragraph break, right, they translate the word in a stronger way.
So they take the word from verse 45 and translate it in verse 44.
Essentially.
Which is, essentially.
Right,
Yeah.
essentially what they're doing.
What I hear you saying then is verse 44 should be understood as the ending of that previous paragraph, sort of the as it were, the first part of the story.
Yes.
The first part of the story, his appearance, the fact that the disciples are disbelieving, they're marveling, he takes fish, he eats it, etc., all that, and then he says, these are the words that I spoke to you while I was with you. Everything written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. That's all part of the first part of the story.
Yeah.
But the second part of the story is where the punch is, it sounds like.
Well, or at least where the transition happens at verse 45, right?
Right.
Which is, then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures, which suggests, of course, that they actually don't understand in verse 44.
They've yet to understand.
They've yet to understand.
Yeah.
They've yet to understand that. Here's the other payoff that happens if you divide the paragraph a little differently. Verse 44, where he says, these are the words that I spoke with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Mm-hmm. That is actually the end of the sequence of different proofs that Jesus is giving to the apostles to convince them. They have the empty tomb. That's not enough for them. They see Jesus. They think he's a ghost. That's not quite enough for them either. They've been invited to touch him. That's not quite enough for them. Then we're told that he eats fish. And this is, one of the big things that happens here is that in the commentaries, people say, well, the touching may not have convinced them, or maybe the touching did convince them, depending on how they read verse 41. Go back to the other podcast to hear about that. But if the touch didn't convince them, then eating the fish did.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And what I would say is that two things. That's an argument from silence, number one, right? Because Luke doesn't say it convinced them. But two, it's also a problem because seeing someone eat fish is not nearly as strong a proof as actually touching them in terms of you're trying to figure out if this person is a ghost or not.
Right? Are they real, right?
Right? Yeah. Are they real?
Because it could be apparition. It could be a vision or something.
Exactly. You have the angels showing up right? And the Emmaus disciples refer to the angel showing up to the women as a vision.
Yeah.
Right? And in fact, in Tobit, which is a Second Temple Jewish text,
Right.
we have a story of an angel who shows up and eats the same food that Jesus eats, broiled fish. He tells Tobit at the end of the story that he wasn't really eating, that he's an angel, that what Tobit was seeing was a vision, right? What you have in terms of proofs for a ghost, in the ancient world, to prove something wasn't a ghost, touch was the core proof.
That was the key thing.
And if that didn't convince them, then eating wouldn't have done necessarily a whole lot more.
Wouldn't have added anything.
Wouldn't have added much more.
So your argument here is that what happens in verse 45 is really key to their believing.
Yes. For example, in the story of Lydia in Acts,
Right.
the Lord has to open her heart, right, to listen to the words of Paul. There's a supernatural opening that is happening. And again, here, verse 45, I think that same kind of thing has happened. Jesus opens their minds to understand. What you have in Luke 24, though, is in the story as a whole, there's a pattern. You have the first part of the story where the women come to the empty tomb. They see the evidence of the empty tomb, but they're not convinced by it. They're simply perplexed by it, Luke says. Then the angel shows up, and he makes a difference because he says, remember what Jesus told you, that it was necessary for him to die and rise again on the third day.
Right.
Right? And that then triggers the women to go and tell the men. Then you get the Emmaus story. Again, they see Jesus. It doesn't convince them. Funny enough, they retell the story of the women, and they say, well, the women saw this vision of angels that say he was alive. The men went to the empty tomb, but they didn't see him.
Yeah.
And so they thought, well, the thing that will convince them is if we see Jesus, that will convince us. But they're saying this to Jesus. They're looking right at Jesus when they're saying it, and yet they still don't believe it. So Jesus then rebukes them. How foolish and slow of heart to believe. But he doesn't say slow of heart to believe the resurrection or to believe the women. He says, how foolish and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. And then again, he opens the scriptures for them and walks them through how they speak to his death and resurrection, right?
Yes.
And when they do finally have their eyes opened and they recognize that it's Jesus, their response is, weren't our hearts burning within us when he was opening the scriptures to us? Again, they perceived the opening of the scriptures as something having an effect in them.
Right.
So when we get to the Jerusalem episode, where with all the apostles, the same pattern occurs. They have evidence. He shows up. They get touched. That's not enough. He has fish. And then what does he do? He says, remember what I told you, right? So
Yes.
it all goes back to the idea of fulfilled prophecy,
Yes.
right? What Jesus does and what the angels do for the women, what Jesus does for the apostles here is he gives them a framework for interpreting the evidence. And that framework is, hey, this fulfills Scripture. That's why you can trust it.
So when that is stated and when their minds are, in a sense, supernaturally opened to receive the Scriptures, and then Jesus commissions them, like you said earlier. This is like the Great Commission in Luke.
Yeah.
Wonderful passage. Great reading of that text. Dr. J.D. Atkins, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks to J.D. Atkins for being with us today on this podcast. He was a visiting fellow at the Lanier Theological Library in Houston in the fall of 2025. We hope he achieved all of his goals while he was resident here with us, and we hope he and his family will be back. If you want to study Greek and Hebrew, I have 2 words for you: Wheaton College. It is the best place I know to study biblical languages, whether at the graduate or undergraduate levels. There are links in the show notes that will take you to the right pages on our website. You don't have to look for them. Get started, and get started today. Thanks to John Lonsma and Rebecca Larson for their roles in producing this podcast. Thanks to our audio editor, the fetching Kathy Capes. Phil Keggy provides our intro and outro music. Until next time, I'm David Capes. Thanks for listening.